in the philosophy pertaining to theology, and also the importance of belief in God in everyday life. So these are the two gentlemen that we'll be discussing, not so much from me. However, I will take this opportunity to illustrate to you the format for tonight's discussion and also do two shameless plugs. The first shameless plug is that there are copies of Professor Krauss's latest book, A Universe from Nothing, being sold up the back. They are $30 each. We're very limited for change, and it's cash sales only. So if you could help with change, that would be fantastic. And Professor Krauss has kindly offered to autograph copies at the conclusion of the discussion forum tonight. Shameless plug number 2 is about the organisation hosting the discussion forum tonight, and that is the Muslim Debate Initiative Australia. The Muslim Debate Initiative Australia started in 2010 as a branch from the worldwide Muslim Debate Initiative. Here in Australia, we've hosted over a dozen public debates and many more public lectures on topics pertaining to Islam and its relationship with other worldviews. We've also started recently orphan sponsorship and other charitable causes. If you would like to know more about the Muslim Debate Initiative, please feel free to register your interest on one of the registration forms later on. And if you would like to contribute to the costs of tonight, we will have donation tins floating around periodically during the evening. The format of tonight is more a discussion forum than a debate. Each speaker will be invited in turn to give an opening presentation on their particular bent on the topic for up to 20 minutes. Now we say up to 20 minutes because it's not a formal debate and we're just capping it so that we can actually get through more than one thing tonight. After each speaker has had about 20 minutes or so to present their overall opinions in turn, we're then going to have a moderated discussion where I, as the moderator, will present each speaker with a question either pertaining to a book that they've written or an article that they've written or the speech that they initially present, and they will then be given approximately 3 minutes to respond, and after that both speakers will have a couple of minutes to discuss the issue amongst themselves. Again, I'm saying about because we're being a little bit loose with the timings, just so that we can actually get information out there and deal with the points at hand. We're not really trying to make sure that the speakers focus on timing, more on the information that they're presenting. After that moderated discussion, we will then invite the audience to present questions. We will start with written questions, and there are slips of paper and pens up the back which we will be handing out in the next couple of minutes. The reason why we'll be starting with written questions is so that the speakers can take a look at what questions are going to be presented to them, but likewise so that individuals who may not be confident enough to initially stand up and ask a question can still participate in this part of the evening. And then after dealing with the written questions, with the time remaining, we'll take live questions from the audience. Finally, the evening will close with a short statement up to 5 minutes from each speaker, and of course then everyone will be invited for some tea, coffee and biscuits at the close, and as I said, we'll be selling copies of Professor Krauss's book. Other than that, it's probably best for me to sit down and allow the men to do their good work. So I'll invite Uthman Badar up to give his initial presentation of 20 minutes.
Bismillah, salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. I begin in the name of God, the gracious and merciful. I thank everyone for taking the time out tonight to be part of this important discussion. Dr. Krauss, moderator, and every one of you who is here tonight. Belief in God, lo and behold, I will be arguing, is indeed liberating. And I'll be doing that on the basis that it's an affirmation of the truth. It is the truth that liberates, and I don't mean that in its cliched sense. I mean that in the sense that to be able to act on the basis of the reality, on the basis of knowledge of the reality, is what allows us to be liberated. as opposed to acting on false conceptions, which are prohibitive, indeed dangerous, depending on how false and wacky they are. And I posit that liberation is not the mere ability to follow one's whims or one's desires. Rather, it is the ability and the resolve to act on the truth, on the reality, on having a knowledge of that reality, for that is what liberates you from the shackles of blind following, of misguided emotion, and of ignorance. Of course, our discussion tonight does not occur in a vacuum, quantum or otherwise. It occurs in a particular context. The context of what we're told is a new atheism, which takes us back, I would argue, almost full circle from the idealist, relativist and skeptic trends of postmodernism to the materialist, positivist and dogmatic trends of modernism. In reality, then, it is an old atheism in a new guise. The old core and the new outer bring together many claims. The presupposition of a clash or an exclusivity between religion and science, the claim of the superiority of the scientific method as a means of ascertaining truth, the advocacy of secular humanism, the claim that there is no evidence for the existence of God, and like claims. So in this initial presentation, I intend to comment briefly on these and related matters in arguing for the proposition that belief in God is liberating, and then from there we can open up through discussion and questions. The understanding that science and religion are at odds with each other, or that there is some type of exclusivity between the two, is superficial and wrong. In the Islamic tradition, for which I primarily speak when I speak of religion, science flourished under Islamic patronage. Muslim scientists were amongst the pioneers in developing the scientific method itself. Rosanna Guarini, a neuroscientist at the University of Rome, writes that according to the majority of historians, the Al-Haytham, known as Al-Hazan in Latin in the West, was the pioneer of the modern scientific method. David Lindbergh, a celebrated American historian of science, notes that the works of Muslim scientists, early Muslim scientists, influenced Roger Bacon, who in turn introduced the empirical method to Europe. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, is well known for pioneering the science of experimental medicine and for being the first physicist to conduct clinical trials. These are not just contributions of individual Muslims. These are contributions of individual Muslims under a system based on a religion, under a system based on Islam, the early caliphates. And of course, another key point here that I should mention is that this so-called golden age of Islam, a 5-century period, 500 years from the 8th to the 13th century, is largely ignored in Western discourse, possibly because a flourishing civilization based on religion, and in which religion and politics are one, belies the secular humanist thesis, as it does the claim that religion stifles science. The reality is that when we speak about ascertaining truth, religion and science both have an important role. Important roles, but different roles. Religion looks at questions of purpose, morality, ethics, metaphysical realities. Science, on the other hand, looks at physical realities in order to understand them, in order to be able to facilitate their exploitation for the benefit of humanity, in theory. The two have different subject matters, and they have different modes of inquiry. Religion does not answer questions of science. In turn, science is unable to answer questions of metaphysics, purpose, and ethics. It tells us how things are, but it cannot tell us how things should be. This is an important point. Those scientists who deprecate the philosophy of science simply do not appreciate or choose to ignore the limitations of science. Yet, of course, no tool can be properly used without an understanding of its boundaries, its limitations. The scientific method, as is well known, consists in systematic observation, measurement, experimentation, the formulation, testing and modification of hypotheses. Numerous matters are important here when we talk about definition and limitation. First, of course, the demarcation problem. What distinguishes science from non-science? We know that verificationism and the positivism of earlier decades in the 20th century have failed, and were bound to fail given their self-refuting nature, which falsifiability suffers from as well. We then also face problems in the validation of scientific reasoning. One is based on inductive reasoning. Two, it is impossible to test a hypothesis in isolation as per the Duhem-Quine thesis. The implication of which is important. The implication of which is to restrict science to areas of what are called intersubjective objects or topics. That is to say, areas where there is general agreement on the nature of the observations involved. And that's relatively easy with physical phenomena, much harder with mental or social phenomena, and extreme or difficult in the extreme on matters of theology or morality. And thus these latter remain outside the purview of science. Three, the interpretation of observations is necessarily theory-laden. Observation can only arbitrate between competing hypotheses within the context of an underlying theory. And four, as one of the new atheists, Daniel Dennett himself, notes, there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. These are all important considerations as to the limitations, the assumptions and the implications of science, ignoring which leads to many problems which I will argue are manifest in the atheist narrative and relevant to our discussion. First, it leads to ideology being passed as science. For example, Dr. Krauss, Professor Krauss, notes in an article he wrote last year that it is hard to think of a grander claim than the existence of a divine being. Clearly, this is a matter of opinion. An opinion based on a bias against the supernatural, or a bias for the natural and against the supernatural. An opinion which prejudices the inquiry or the inquiry before it's even begun. In the same article he wrote, quote, "In science, when one is trying to explain and predict data, one tries to explore all possible physical causes for some effect before resorting to the supernatural. Yet surely one should not resort to anything in any sincere inquiry. We don't resort to anything. Rather, you follow the evidence and you affirm that which the evidence leads to. And in doing so, to preference the natural over the supernatural is ideology, plain and simple, and reveals, I think, the materialist and the naturalist tendencies underpinning much of modern science. There is no rational or scientific reason as to why the supernatural should be a last resort. The supernatural is, after all, no more than that which is extra-spatial and extra-temporal, that which is beyond space-time, which defines the natural world. Ideology being passed as science is noticeable, evident, in cosmology as well. An editorial in the New Scientist magazine from January this year notes, over the years, cosmologists have tried on several different models. They have tried on several different models of the universe that dodge the need for a beginning while still requiring a Big Bang. Note, requiring models that dodge the need for a beginning while still requiring a Big Bang. Expressing similar sentiments, Stephen Hawking, at a symposium convened earlier this year in January in honor of his 70th birthday, said about this beginning of the universe, that a point of creation would be a place where science broke down. One would have to appeal to religion and the hand of God. And of course, that's not something that's a cardinal sin in science, to appeal to religion or the hand of God. Lisa Grossman, reporting in the New Scientist on that same meeting, that symposium, wrote one bold proposal. She was reporting about one of the papers presented by Alexander Vilenkin. One bold proposal suggests that the universe is not eternal, resurrecting the thorny question of how to kickstart the cosmos without the hand of a supernatural creator. Again, note, it's not a question of what are the origins of the universe. It's a question of how do we kickstart the origin of the universe without the hand of a supernatural creator. Thus, this assumed need to dodge a particular conclusion, clearly an unscientific and irrational approach, is evident. Can such an approach, we may well ask, be liberating? In fact, it is apparent that the various exotic scenarios conjured up in modern cosmology, loop quantum gravity models, string models, closed time-like curve models, etc., were introduced in an attempt to avoid the absolute beginning established by the Big Bang model. All fail, all are highly speculative, and all, even if true, do nothing but to push the beginning back a step. The conclusion by one of the world's leading cosmologists, Alexander Vilenkin, whom I trust Dr. Krauss knows well, presented again at the aforementioned meeting a kind of unwanted birthday present for Stephen Hawking was, and I quote, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. A qualification here, I'm not trying to prove the existence of God by the beginning or any of that. At this stage, I'm just showing the limitations, the problems that occur when you ignore some of the limitations of science and the ideology that's being passed as science. Second, ignoring the limitations of science also leads to sloppy and arbitrary science. A good example is the field, or at least a relevant example, is the field of quantum mechanics, which has, it must be said, held up to rigorous and thorough experimental testing, but which is open to many interpretations. We have over 10 different interpretations, all highly speculative. Copenhagen, instrumentalism, many worlds, consistent histories, the ensemble, collapse theory, and the list, objective collapse theory, and the list goes on. What this means is that the real world implications, you have the mathematical structures, you have the interpreting structure, the maths is rigorous, the experimentation is rigorous, but the interpretations are highly speculative and numerous. What that means is that the real world implications of the testing of quantum mechanics expressed in highly abstract mathematical terms is extremely uncertain and speculative. Yet this does not faze, and this is the point, this does not faze the informed and the ignorant alike in using quantum mechanics as some sort of black box that can be used to explain away anything and everything. Can such an approach, again, we may ask, be liberating? A third error arising from ignoring the limitations of science, which is key to this discussion, is the conflation between rational evidence and scientific evidence, such that the former is restricted to the latter. In truth, scientific or empirical evidence is one type of rational evidence, but not the only type. Other types include logic, reports, and conceptual analysis. Logical reasoning, for example, based on sound premises and valid structures is entirely rational. Excuse me. The proposition that all men are mortal, combined with the observation that Dr. Krauss is a man, is that fair?
I don't know.
Okay. Establishes rationally and necessarily that Dr. Krauss is mortal. Numerous unrelated people informing someone who has never been to China in a way where collusion to lie is inconceivable amongst these people, that they have been there proves rationally, even for him or her who has not sensorially perceived the existence of China, that it exists. Our affirmation of the concept that human beings are born of a mother and a father allows us to establish, on analysis of this concept, on extension of the concept, that, for example, Mr. Kunde, our benevolent moderator, had a great-great-great-grandfather. Is that fair? Okay, fair enough. Just trying to be equal here. None of these conclusions are scientific, for they do not involve the application of the scientific method, yet all of them are rational. Again, these all have limitations and principles by which they need to apply for them to reach sound conclusions. Similarly, the evidence for the existence of God is entirely rational, although not scientific. The Kalam cosmological argument, for example, the strongest proof in our estimation, was developed by Muslim scholars as early as the 9th century of the Common Era. The argument is profound yet simple. The material world, which we sense directly, comprises of temporal phenomena, temporary, transitory, limited, dependent phenomena, which depend for their existence on other temporal phenomena, which in turn do the same thing, and so forth. Such a series cannot continue to infinity, for if it did, no one thing would satisfy its dependence and nothing would exist. If A depends on B, depends on C, and we go to continue the series without end, A would not exist, nothing would exist. The entire series would not exist. For example, a tree depends on sunlight, which in turn depends on, amongst many other things, this is just one branch, if you will, photosynthesis, which depends on carbon dioxide and covalent bonding, and you can go on and on. But the point is, if the chain doesn't end, you don't have the tree. In fact, you don't have any aspects of the entire series. And the opposite is true. If the tree exists, the chain cannot be infinite. And therefore, the fact that things do exist necessarily implies a finite series, and in turn the existence of a being who determine both the existence of the series and the specific attributes or properties that define it. By extension, by rational extension, this being must be eternal and without beginning. Otherwise, it is temporal and forms part of the series, and we end up in the same problem. It must also be sentient, having an independent will, for a timeless cause producing a temporal effect requires an independent will. Otherwise, a mechanical cause would always exist with its effect. Finally, effecting so grand a creation as the universe and all that it contains necessitates knowledge and power. And thus, by the use of reason alone, no reference to scripture, no leaps of faith or assumptions, no gaps being filled, by resorting to God, we deduce the existence of an eternal, necessary, and transcendent being attributed with knowledge, power, and sentience, otherwise known in the English language as God. Of course, that is all we prove. To say anything more, to resort to scripture, would not be legitimate from these premises alone. Finally, I would like to point out some of the problems faced by atheism, which is a negating proposition, and therefore the burden of proof is not on the atheist to prove that God does not exist. It's a negative proposition. But nevertheless, even as a negating proposition, it makes numerous assertions, implicit or explicit, that need to be substantiated. Negating the existence of God leaves only two options with regards to the origins of the universe. Either it's always been there, it's infinite, or it came from nothing. There are no other options. And also, negating the existence of God also leaves the atheist with no choice but to adopt secularism and humanism, which are positive assertions demanding substantiation. But is the universe eternal? Can an infinite regress of temporal causes actually exist? Even presuming it can, on what grounds should we ignore the bulk of modern astrophysical evidence that points to an absolute beginning? Or did the universe come from nothing? Can something... Time? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
And
premise seems
thank
so
you very much
obvious
for
to
that,
me.
Othman.
I didn't think it required a
And
lot
I'll
of
now
discussion about
invite
whether
Professor
belief in God is
Krauss up
prohibited
for
or
his
liberating.
opening
Part
statement.
of a clear example that it's prohibitive is that not being a person of faith, I didn't have to start my discussion by whatever Arabic sentence you had to start yours with. I'm free to start it with however I want, which is I find liberating. Now, let me first say I want to thank you very much for the kind graciousness with which you invited me, and I'm very hesitant to say some of the things I'm going to say because I learned to be polite to your hosts. But I think it's polite in some sense to try and point out nonsense when nonsense is there, even if it's offensive. So I'm sorry that I'm sure I will offend some people in this audience. I generally offend people in every audience, so you should feel not particularly special. So that's my only defense. What I wanted to do was this announcement for this discussion was presented with a series of questions. After belief in God, prohibitive or liberating, were a series of questions, the first of which is a belief in God rational or irrational? I want to make some comments on that, and I'll make comments on each thing. The first is I decided to look up the organization that invited me, the Muslim Debate Initiative, since you were very rational in your invitation. And I was kind of astounded by how irrational the basis of the organization is. If you'll forgive me, but it said the MDI believes that holds there be no God except one God, the Muhammad, and its final prophet and messenger. MDI also believes that all the preceding prophets named in the Quran, you believe in them all. Furthermore, the MDI holds that the Quran is a revealed communication from God and thus held to be true and accurate. The examples and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad are universal examples for us to hold on to for all times and places. Lastly, we hold that since humans have not changed in essence or nature since their beginning, the laws of Islam are unchanging and relevant for all timescales. Thus, MDI believes that Islam is intellectually sound and a perfect and complete way of life for mankind. Well, it's hard to know how to work from there because that's obviously nonsense. Humans have not been unchanging in nature and essence. That's the whole basis of evolution. Humans have changed in their characteristics in many, many ways, not just before they became tribal societies, during which their mores, group sizes, xenophobia, all of which has changed. Their cultural evolution has affected humans as much as anything else, but also their biological evolution. Depends where you decide to limit humans. One of the big problems, of course, of religion is that somehow, is at least of the organized religions, is that somehow the first 250,000 years of human evolution is ignored, and all of those poor beings that suffered and died nameless in agony, unfortunately, were not subject to be saved because they didn't exist until the various prophets of the world's major religions. But so to say that something, because humans have not changed in their essence and nature since the beginning, the laws of Islam are unchanging and relevant for all times and places, is just obvious nonsense. And so it's hard to know how one can call that nonsense rational. Because rationality is based on, in fact, in general, on the evidence of the world around us. It is people who would go out and say that it's light during the night, we would say are irrational. People who might claim, for example, that Jesus told them to drown their children in a bathtub, we might say are irrational. Unless, of course, that was the basis of a religion. Now, the obvious fact that belief in God is in general irrational is that not all beliefs can be true. As is often stated, everyone of faith is an atheist against all other religions. The only difference between people of faith and atheists is that they're an atheist against one additional religion. And So the point is that since not all religious beliefs can be true because they're mutually inconsistent, the doctrines of each are based on known scientific nonsense. If you literally read the scriptures, clearly, not every religious belief can be rational. It is generally true, from my experience in addressing audiences of people of faith, that that fact is accepted. But what is always accepted is that the other people's faiths are irrational, and the people's own faith is rational. There's no objective evidence of that at all. Now, clearly the doctrines of each of the world's major religions, and I'll try, as I say, normally I think because of the context of this, I'll try and refer to Islam a little bit, although I don't think there's anything special about Islam. In fact, there certainly isn't anything special about Islam in the dubiousness of the scriptures. I think it shares that with all the world's great religions, and also in the immorality inherent in their scriptures. The immorality that I think most rational people today would look for is inherent in all of those documents, because they were based on societies that, after all, they were based on, in many cases, on the statements of illiterate peasants before we knew that the sun was the center, or almost the center, of our solar system. This great work that was created, and the great cosmology that formed the basis of this Kalam argument, was based before we knew that the Earth orbited the sun and not the other way around. So it's hard to take serious a cosmology based on a universe that people didn't even yet understand, much less the other stars, galaxies, and the Big Bang. But we'll get to that. So the first point is that clearly the creation myths, miracles, the belief in God being rational is kind of ridiculous. And the basis of that is that we look at the world's religions, in particular Islam, which is based on an oral tradition. So we don't even have the written tradition, but we're told that that oral tradition, written down ultimately by people up to 300 years after the effect, is the established word of God. Moreover, we're also told that unless you read it in Arabic, you really don't understand it, which suggests, of course, that God is a monoglot. One would hope that God would be able to speak more than one language, but generally one reads the same thing, in fact, for each of the world's religions, whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic for the Old Testament, or Greek or Latin beyond that. If there really is some ultimate truth, it shouldn't depend on a language, certainly if God created a universe with lots of languages. At the same time, the question is it rational to believe that to accept as the undeniable word of God the claims of an illiterate peasant, that they were visited by an angel who told them the truth? I view that in Islam as equally ridiculous as, for example, the claim of Joseph Smith in the Mormon religion that he was also visited by the same angel, by the way, much later, who also revealed the truth to him. Revealed, for example, that Jesus would be visiting Missouri later on, which sounds ridiculous now because it's more recent than those old claims. But the fundamental difference, perhaps, between Muhammad and Joseph Smith is that Joseph Smith was a known con man. Muhammad wasn't. And so, therefore, we could say, in some sense, that claim of the Mormon religion, that Joseph Smith, who, by the way, previously been convicted of claiming to find fake treasure, and of course the basis of the Mormon religion is that he found golden tablets in upstate New York, which he then translated with the help of an angel. He discovered them in the 19th century, translated them unerringly into 17th century English. I mean, accepting that kind of ridiculousness, I don't think most people would claim is rational. The basis of the scriptures, of course, the scriptures are full of irrational statements. The virgin birth, the fact that the sun stood still in the Old Testament, these things are clear nonsense. One would have to ask for the rationality of believing that Muhammad ascended to heaven from a place that it wasn't clear he ever visited. But more than that, the claim that you should believe something as to be divine because someone claims it's divine is to give up rationality. Again, because a woman drowns her children in the bathtub because she claims that Jesus told her to, in fact, if you look at the courts nowadays, what they did was clearly she was not rational. She was insane. Now, let me just go back to some of the statements, because I did read some of the work of Dr. Badar. You're a doctor, I assume. No, it doesn't matter anyway.
Almost.
It doesn't matter. You're almost a doctor. Having a PhD means nothing except you have a PhD, so it doesn't really matter.
That's right.
But the claim that there's other types, I've often been told when I've debated Christian apologists, who are the people I tend to debate more in my country, which is one of the reasons why I decided to come here, because I wanted to learn from you what arguments you present, is that there's some knowledge other than scientific knowledge that leads to rationality, and they're logic, reports, and conceptual analysis. And the point is that our logic derives from the evidence of reality. Tom, all men are mortal. Tom is a man, therefore Tom is mortal. Well, that's true unless we make people immortal. It's quite possible in this century, in fact, my good friend Freeman Dyson, who I was just debating with on another context last week, was arguing that, in fact, it's quite possible that we'll make people immortal. We'll learn how to stop cell death. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that, but if we do, will they stop being human? No. The evidence of logic derives from the evidence of reality. Is it logical that I can be in two places at once? No, at least by classical logic. But if I'm an electron, I certainly can be. Because while you referred to quantum mechanics, I actually understand it. And quantum mechanics is based on the fact that particles are in many places at the same time. And if you deny that, in fact, you come up with the wrong answers. Now, people can say, well, the interpretation of quantum mechanics is subjective and philosophical, but the point is, the computer you used to present your display was based on quantum mechanics, semiconductors, and in fact, the science works. That's the key point. The science works regardless of your philosophical interpretation. The Big Bang really happened regardless of whether you interpret it to provide evidence for your belief in God or evidence that there's no need for God, that the laws of physics take you back to t=0. So logic, of course, derives from empirical reality. It doesn't derive from your brain. If you do, you come up with statements which change over time. The logic, as I say, that an object can't be in two places at once, was subsumed once we realized that particles can be in two places at once. And the key point of science is it's forced you to realize that your logic must derive from the evidence of reality. Rather than imposing your wishes on reality, you have to impose what you believe to be true based on what reality tells you, rather than the other way around. Now, the other thing is reports. So you'd say that people tell you you've been to China. A lot of people, I've debated alien abductees, and I've had a lot of people tell me that they've been up to spacecraft. So should I believe that those spacecraft exist simply because they tell me they believe they've been to them? Absolutely not. Most of us would argue that, and should I believe that woman who heard voices? Well, I can believe she heard voices. Should I believe they're from Jesus? Absolutely not. Without independent verification, outrageous claims require outrageous evidence. And I was amused that you pointed out that I claimed that a belief in a divine being was a grand belief, and then you pointed out with your Kalam argument that in fact there could be nothing grander than someone who'd created a universe as complex as ours. So I think it's a pretty grand belief and requires important evidence. And then you say the acceptance of the fact that our esteemed moderator had a great-great-great-grandfather is not scientific. Well, of course it is. It's based on empirical evidence. Evidence that each of us has a mother and father. That's empirical evidence. Okay? And so you cannot, if you don't base your logic and your conceptual analysis and your evidence of reports on the basis of empirical evidence, you're not rational. And I think you demonstrated that in the fact that every claim you had for rationality depended upon what we would call the scientific method. We'll have time to talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, but it amazes me by its vacuousness. But it was designed by people in the 11th century who didn't know any better, which is fine. But we now, for example, know how to sum infinite series. Infinities are no problem in mathematics. And moreover, even if you argue, as in fact I would not argue against the fact that the universe had a beginning. It had a beginning in the Big Bang. But the claim then that requires a being to create it also reminds me of the claim of people who see UFOs and they require there to be aliens in them instead of arguing that they could be due to something else. And the requirement that the creation requires knowledge and power is also ridiculous, because as I've described in my book and other places, we now know that whole universes can be created with no knowledge and power. In fact, it requires no energy to create a universe. It requires no power whatsoever. But of course, it would seem that way if you're in the 11th century because you don't know any better. But happily, science has taught us something. Now, when it comes to ideology, of course, I have no ideology. My faith is incredibly shakeable. And let me make it clear that I won't define myself as an atheist. I would never argue that I can prove definitively that there's no purpose to the universe. I see no evidence of purpose, and that governs my life. But I would rather describe myself as my late friend Christopher Hitchens described himself, as an anti-theist. Namely, I would not argue that there's not a God. I just certainly wouldn't want to live in a universe with one. I wouldn't want to live in a universe with a cosmic Saddam Hussein who would condemn me to eternal fire or turn me into a pillar of salt because I look back, who would take the dignity of being a human being away from me. As my friend Steven Weinberg, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, has said, that religion is an assault on human dignity. And I happen to think so. I happen to agree with that fact. Because the claim that we cannot determine the meaning of our lives and how we can act, that we are told how to act by someone who is so insecure that if we act differently, they won't condemn us to their prison for a few years, but to hell for an eternity. That we are told, and I'm often told, if we give away our belief in God, how can we have morality? I was on a radio program in the United States recently where someone said, well, if this is true and the meaning of our lives is just established by the meaning we make and the value we give to each other and the rationality we hold that some way that maximum human happiness is a good thing without being told by God. But if I get rid of the God, then what stops me from murdering my neighbor? Well, if any of you stopped believing in God, I would ask you, would you go out tomorrow and murder your neighbor? Well, some of you say yes. And for those people, I say, I'm really sorry for you. Let me get to a few of the other questions. How much longer do I have?
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, well, that'll be good enough for the next 6 questions. What is the role of religion in our public lives? Clearly, there shouldn't be any role of religion in our public lives. We don't have any role. We're governed by all of us in democracies are governed by constitutions that are based on laws that are determined by what is rational and good. And we discuss that, even in my own country, the Founding Fathers, if they thought the Bible was a basis of morality, and thank God they didn't, excuse the pun, they didn't. They established a constitution because they didn't believe the Bible was useful. And I'm very happy because, of course, if you look at the Old Testament, if I were governed by that I would stone my children for disobeying me, or decide, for example, that if I had guests who were male and threatened, I should put my daughters out to be raped instead because, of course, women are dispensable. I don't find those morals valuable, but I do find the morals of the U.S. Constitution valuable. I suspect you'd find the morals of the laws of Australia mostly rational, and you debate them based on rationality. Is science sufficient to make religion redundant? No. Clearly, science alone does not satisfy the human need we have for groupiness, for in and out groups, for the ability to like others and not like others, for the need to feel something greater than ourselves. Science alone doesn't provide that. But what science can provide, being as a basis in reality, is a sound basis for meeting those other needs, instead of a basis based on myth and superstition, ignorance, violence, and hatred. Is there a way forward for humanity? Should it be a return to God or a completion of the secularization process? Clearly, if we look at the challenges of the 21st century, what we need are rational approaches to global warming, to the need for civilizations to work together to meet our needs together, instead of having the divisiveness and hatred, which is obviously an empirical result of religion if we look at human history. Probably we're about done, right?
Oh, you've got a little bit more.
No, what the hell.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Krauss. And so that concludes our opening statements portion. We're now going to proceed on to the moderated discussion, and as I said, it will be basically me presenting an initial discussion point question to one of the speakers. That first speaker will be given a couple of moments to respond, and then there'll be discussion between the two speakers for a few more moments if necessary, and then we'll proceed to another one. I'll start with Uthman because he was the first speaker, and I don't want to make it easy for him because he's on home turf, so to speak. Dr. Krauss has given a basic example of how the system of Islam could be considered restrictive, and he said that he is not restricted. He said that he was not restricted in how he's opened up the discussion this evening, but perhaps that we were. Now, obviously, you would agree that the system of Islam is much more comprehensive than even minor issues like that. What's your comment on that?
Okay. Well, I think that goes back to the point I made in the beginning about how we define liberation. That sort of takes the view that liberation is you can do what you want, and I don't think that's the type of liberation that we want. Having said that, everyone is still restricted by their understanding of the world. Whatever view you carry, it's not as if you put yourself in a vacuum outside of the ideas and your understanding of your surroundings. You use that. So the only reason Dr. Krauss is unrestricted to begin how he wants is because he believes so. That's his understanding of the world. And so you cannot put ideology aside. Even if you say you don't have an ideology, you're still restricted. But nevertheless, the point is, I would argue liberation is a bit more than that. It's to rise above the mere urge to follow your desires and your whims, to act and to ascertain the reality and to act on its basis, whether you like it or not.
Lawrence, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, yeah. Well, you keep talking about science as ideology. I mean, the stars, I would argue the stars shine with the same colors they would shine with, independent of whether physics was done by dead white men. Moreover, I'm restricted in what I can do. I thought about giving this talk while standing upside down on the ceiling, but the laws of nature didn't allow it. And in fact, I'm restricted by the laws of nature. In fact, if we base our actions on the laws of nature and the evidence of reality, I would argue we make sensible decisions about then how to act. And so, in fact, if we base our decisions on clear myths and superstitions or clear evidence that the earth is 6,000 years old when it isn't, then we'll make decisions that are irrational. I don't argue by any way that liberation implies that anything is possible. In fact, I'm amazed, you see, when I asked the question, if you didn't believe in God, would you kill your neighbor? And this gentleman in the back said yes. Well, it seems to me that suggests that in fact, if you believe that, then you ultimately believe it's liberating to do whatever you want. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, man is born free but lives forever in chains. And we are chained by the evidence of living in a community and a society. We create laws for that reason. And liberation doesn't mean doing whatever you want. In fact, I would argue that people who base their actions on reality realize you are constrained by rational thinking and evidence. And in fact, that's why there's not a single person who doesn't believe in God who would say, if I don't believe in God, I think it's reasonable to kill my neighbor. And if they did, we would say they're irrational. So I would argue that if you require the crutch of God to liberate you or to stop you from being liberated, then you are in a much worse situation than someone who can use the crutch of rationality.
If either one of you has any further thoughts to add.
I think we agree in essence there. I mean, Krauss come back and said that it's not about just being able to do whatever you want. Everyone's restricted. So for me, I think in the end, the question goes back to what is the reality, and that's why this whole issue of whether you're restricted to what you begin a speech with is a bit beyond the point. In the end, it's about the reality, and that's what we're here to discuss today. What is a closer ascertainment of the truth, and what are the best means to do that?
Yeah, well, I'll throw in one. I think we are agreed that indeed there are restrictions on what you can and should do, and where those restrictions come from is it should be reality. And I think one has to ask the question: what's the basis for believing? In fact, going from an argument that maybe the universe had purpose to some illiterate peasant telling you that what he wrote down is the Word of God. I just think there's a huge leap there, and a huge leap of irrationality.
I think there's two good points coming on from that discussion, and we might jump back to them. First, Lawrence, I'd like to direct a question to you. Mm-hmm. In A Universe from Nothing, I must admit I found 90% of the book presenting basically no argument against the existence of God. And I actually quite enjoyed that, because I think that it's fantastic that I can sort of sit down and read a book like that and not have my beliefs necessarily challenged. However, I found the chapter Brave New World sort of leaning a bit towards it, right there. And certainly the afterword from Professor Dawkins to be quite clearly anti-theist.
That's
and indeed, I'm not sure if you've read it, but I read Professor Dawkins' latest work, Great Shine Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. And I was actually quite disappointed that throughout the book there's a number of, honestly I would refer to them as pithy jokes against religion. So there's a section where he's referring to the evolution of sunflowers, and he actually makes comment about Russian Orthodox traditions and Catholic traditions pertaining to Lent, which I thought were kind of unrelated. But getting to the point of my question, I just want to give you a background.
If I can take as long to answer it as you take to answer it. Okay.
Your time doesn't start until I finish waffling. Yeah. So the question ultimately is, don't you think that really it's the job of popular scientists such as yourself and Professor Dawkins to present science as science and not always couple it with anti-theist arguments? And at the same time, don't you think that by sort of doing, not so much what you're doing, but certainly by what Professor Dawkins is doing, that you're in fact making or facilitating belief in God becoming prohibitive, because it means that most believers would not actually pick up your books?
Well, look, I don't completely disagree with you. If you watch my debates with Richard, you've seen that I have concerns about, I've often thought, in spite of the way I've acted tonight, that if you want to convince someone of something, the best way is not to first tell them they're stupid, and that you're right, although that's how most arguments happen, I suppose. And so, but it amazes me. Well, there's two things you said that amazed me. One discouraged me tremendously. One, you found it very heartening to read a book that didn't challenge your beliefs. Well, that was the worst thing you can say about a book, I think. In science, every day we challenge our beliefs. That's how science works. Most people think science works the other way around. But in fact, what you want to do when you come into work every day if you're a scientist is you want to prove all your colleagues are wrong. Because that's the way you get famous. And in fact, the key thing, as Richard Feynman, who I wrote another book about and I've lectured here in Canberra about, would say that, what you try and do if you have an idea, if you're a scientist, is you have a theory and you try and prove it right, but you try and prove it wrong. You try and spend more time proving it wrong. Because, first of all, the easiest person to fool is yourself. It's easy, we all think things happen to us are significant, and Feynman used to go around and say, you won't believe what happened to me today, you just won't believe what happened to me. And people would say, what? And he'd say, absolutely nothing. And because we all believe when something happens to us, it's significant. It has some cosmic significance. You can have 1,000 dreams over many nights. They're nonsense, but you dream one night that a friend of yours is going to break their leg, and the next day they break their arm, and you say, cosmic. You don't realize accidents happen. And so we have to challenge our beliefs every single day. That's what science is all about. There are no scientific ideologies, and in fact, the reason science had progressed and theology hasn't, the reason we have video cameras and lights and medicine and make our lives, and we can feed more people and live longer, healthier lives, is because science changes. The great thing about science is there are no unshakable truths. We force and we don't even believe anything. We force the way we view reality to depend upon the evidence of reality. So if you don't challenge your beliefs, you're never learning. You're never questioning yourself. And so I hope that every student who ever goes to university, at one point in their life, has the opportunity to have something that is at the heart of their being, something so central to their being that if they lose it, they won't feel they're human anymore, to be proved wrong. Because that's the liberation that science provides. The realization that to assume the truth, to assume the answer before you ask the questions, leads you nowhere. And that's why science has led to a modern world where, in fact, we can make progress. So I think that really discouraged me about what you said, but the second part of the point is that, in some sense, you're absolutely right. I don't think it is an effective teaching tool, pedagogical tool, to turn people off before you talk to them. On the other hand, at the same time, and having spent a lot of time with Richard, and we'll be spending a lot of time in Australia here, I think it's important to be able to express ridicule. Because nothing is sacred, if you'll forgive the pun. No idea should be above ridicule. Ridicule is a very important tool. And I think ridicule points to people and gets them to think about what they're doing. And why should religion not be subject to ridicule? If politics is subject to ridicule, if science, if sex, if everything else in the world is subject to ridicule as a way of illuminating reality, why shouldn't religion?
Just before I invite Othman to comment, I'll hopefully re-encourage you. As a chemistry major, sometimes we get delusioned into thinking that we know stuff about science that unfortunately only those from the physics faculty do know.
Well, it's true. Chemistry is a one-hour lecture in physics.
It certainly did encourage me to challenge what I thought I knew about cosmology. I guess what I meant was that it didn't challenge me in beliefs that I consider to be separate. I don't think that my belief in God should come up in a science textbook. I guess that's the point that I'm...
Oh, and by the way, that's the other thing that upset me, is you claim something that people always claim about this particular book of mine, that I somehow argue against the existence of God. You find, all I do is ask the question, is it possible to have a universe that arose naturally? Let's ask if that's plausible. But I have found in the United States, constantly, if you simply ask a question, you're deemed strident atheist, arguing against the existence of God. I ask the question, is it possible that you don't need a supernatural being to create a universe? And what do we know about the universe? I don't claim anywhere that that's required or necessary or true, because that would be based on, it require more knowledge than I have. I just point out that what is amazing and remarkable is that the discoveries of the last century have shown us that it's plausible that a universe could come from nothing, just like the discoveries of biology over the last 150 years have shown us it's plausible that all the diversity of life on Earth not only derived from a single organism, but the laws of chemistry might have turned into biology. We don't yet know the origin of life, but it's certainly plausible. So if you say it's plausible that God didn't breathe life into the first organism, that's a plausible question. It's not an atheistic, dogmatic, strident statement. But the minute I say that, people will tell me it's strident atheist.
Well, I'll invite Othman to comment, and then I'll say, but I certainly disagree with some of those reviews that you've got in the United States. I think that has to do with the demographic over there. Anyway, Othman, if you'd like to comment, please.
Thank you. I thought I was out of the discussion there for a while.
You're back here.
I'm back. Yeah, I think that now we're touching upon some of the critical issues that touch this subject matter. I'll touch on just a few of the points that Dr. Krauss mentioned. And on the one hand, he's saying there's no unshakable beliefs of science, and at the same time, he mentioned a number of points that seem to be quite unshakable and not even provable scientifically. So whether we start from the empirical method, the fact that the empirical method is the method that needs to be used, that's an unshakable belief. If you change that, you won't have science anymore. And then, of course, other sort of non-scientific propositions, nothing is sacred. Can you prove that scientifically? You just made a logical argument based on some understanding of your understanding of the world. So this idea that we should challenge our beliefs, I agree. in some areas. And this is the point I tried to touch upon, the difference between science and religion in my presentation. Only when you appreciate the difference can you ascertain whether different propositions apply or not. So for example, you shouldn't challenge your beliefs. Science is about physical realities. We seek to understand how things work, how they develop, how they evolve, how we can exploit them to our benefit. There's no issue that they should change every day. You should challenge them. Religion or theology, or whatever you want to call it, anything about higher truth, about morality, for example. Do you want me to challenge my belief every day that murder is wrong? Should I get up tomorrow and go, geez, murder could be right today? You don't want to change. So it's about the subject matter. We can't make a generalization. And this is why we need to appreciate the limitation of science, which is a great thing, but has a particular framework, a particular mode of inquiry that is to be used. He also mentioned, again, with respect to the empirical method, and he touched upon earlier this issue of logic, and all of them were empirical. If by empiricism we're meaning that there's some sense perception involved, I agree. Every single rational thought has to be based in some sensation of reality, otherwise it's just airy-fairy waffle. I agree with that. But that's not the scientific method. Scientific method is not just that there's sense perception involved. And if you want to redefine it as that, I don't mind, then the proof of the existence of God that I presented is also scientific, because I started with the fact of the temporal phenomena around us. So I think it's easy if you redefine things, then we don't have set parameters to talk about, but the scientific method involves more than just sense perception. It involves hypotheses, experimentation, testing, modification of hypotheses, observations. The whole lot together is what makes it. Last point, why should religion be above ridicule? That's a good question. He said everything else is, that's a logical argument. Why should religion be excluded from influence on public affairs? Everything else is allowed. Why religion? And if we think about this question rationally, the only reason is the negative experience, the negative Christian experience in Europe in the Middle Ages, a very specific, historically, geographically, contextually, politically specific experience that has now been universalized to say that religion is bad. I've already shown that we've had 5 centuries of historical experience where science flourished under a religion. So there's a bit more here than, I think, broad generalizations that need to be discussed.
Could I? Okay.
Certainly, closing comments.
Yeah, sure. Well, 3 things. When I said nothing is sacred, of course, what I meant was there are no authorities whose word is not subject to question. That's the basis of science. There are no such things as scientific authorities. There are scientific experts. But I hope that every student here, who are students, will feel perfectly free to assume their professors may be wrong. And in fact, that's the basis of progress. So there are no authorities. There's nothing that's, if we live in a world where certain things are not subject to question, we live in a world where thinking is stopped. As far as the question of whether you question your own beliefs, of course you do. Because in fact, I imagine you came to your belief in Islam through a series of analyses. I doubt you were born with it, in spite of the fact that we labeled children of Muslims as Muslim, and we labeled children of Christians as Christian. In spite of that, we don't ever call them neoliberals or libertarians or conservatives. Here's a 2-year-old conservative. But we're perfectly happy to say, here's a 2-year-old Catholic child. What an awful thing to do to a child. It's child abuse. And so you didn't come to it because of some revelation when you were 3 months old. You came to it through reading, thinking, and questioning. And I imagine you might have asked yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Is it the Kalam cosmological argument? You questioned yourself. And that's important. Now, as far as your proof that I mean, I didn't want to belittle the argument of the cosmological argument, which is clearly based on ignorance. And that's okay, because it was 11th century. People were ignorant back then. But infinite series are no problem. The series, do you know what the series 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 to infinity adds up to? Minus 112. I'll be happy to prove it to you sometime. It's ridiculous, but true. And the point that you're making that science can flourish under a religious system, well, Newton was a Christian, but that doesn't prove to me that the laws of physics are correct. What proves to me the laws of physics are correct is that they work. In fact, he spent most of his time as an alchemist, and most of his time he's much more interested in religion than he was in physics. But in fact, most of his writing was religious. But if he didn't write the physics writing, no one here would know who Newton was, because he wouldn't have made any impact on human knowledge and human society and the ending of burning of witches. The last thing I will say is that, indeed, from 5 centuries, in fact, the Islamic world was the center of mathematics, science, and culture. But it ended. And it ended, I would argue, for the same reason that the Greek Renaissance of knowledge ended. And it ended because of the ignorance of religious fundamentalism. Okay.
Just on the infinity, if I can quickly, I think it's come up twice now already. It's obviously key to the argument I presented, this idea that there's no problem with infinity in mathematics. I agree. There's no problem with infinity in mathematics or in physics or in other studies. That's not the point. There's a difference between infinity, the idea of a potential infinity as an idea, and actual infinity in the real world. And don't take my word for it. Here's what the mathematicians say. David Hilbert, any mathematicians in the room? They're a rare breed.
I did a degree in mathematics.
They're a rare breed these days. David Hilbert is a renowned mathematician was a renowned mathematician of the 20th century, after whom Hilbert spaces and Hilbert operators that are prevalent in quantum mechanics is used. He said, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature, nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." Kastner and Newman, contemporary renowned mathematicians, quote, "The infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. Existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from existence of objects in the physical world." This is important. I mean, we've all done maths in class. When you do y equals 1 over x, and the teacher tells you, well, this graph goes to the axis and keeps going but never touches it. It's an idea, it's a concept, but it never touches. Right? You can't bring that into the real world, where there's nowhere in the real world, within our sensorially perceivable natural world, within space-time, that infinity can exist. If it does, you end up with a whole host of contradictions. If we had an infinite number of people in this room and 5 left, how much do we have?
We can handle it well.
An infinite number of people, right? But 5 have left. So there's a distinction between the idea of infinity and the ontological reality of infinity in the real world.
Two things are important. It always bugs me with philosophers, because they always read statements by people, because philosophy is based on authority, which is one of the reasons philosophy hasn't made much progress either. I don't care what David Hilbert said. David Hilbert wasn't a physicist. He didn't even, well, he almost discovered general relativity, but he didn't. He was an amazing mathematician. But how did David Hilbert know that there's no such thing as infinity? What if space is infinite? Now, I don't know if space is infinite, but what if it is? Okay, there you go. So, because David Hilbert tells me nothing can be infinite, space can't be infinite, who the hell cares what David Hilbert says? And moreover, if space is continuous, and it may not be given the laws of quantum mechanics, but I don't know, then between 0 and 1 there are an infinite number of numbers. The irrational numbers, the rational numbers, you can choose, you can take your pick, but there are an infinite number of them. And so, this notion that because some mathematician makes some statement that it can't happen is just the kind of argument from authority that leads to the kind of ridiculousness that you just spouted. Now, the fact is, I don't think the universe is infinite in the past time. I think it had a beginning, the Big Bang. Now, does that argue there had to be a God? Absolutely not. And in my book, I describe in great detail it's not necessary. But let me give you an argument that is even beyond that. It's quite evident from the laws of general relativity that space and time depend on the nature of matter. It matters when the laws of physics break down, as they will do at the very earliest moments of the Big Bang, based on the laws of physics we now understand. It's quite plausible that not only did space not exist, but time didn't exist. So there's no question of before. Causality goes out the window. There was no time before the Big Bang. Time came into existence when the Big Bang came into existence. So the notion of causality and infinite regression it doesn't matter because we change, because what we understand is that the universe is different than we thought, and before doesn't mean anything if there's no before. So we just have to be willing to moderate our ideas based on what the universe tells us. I know I went on too long, sorry.
All right. Again, lots of points coming up from that. Goodness me. I wish I could have all the time in the audience and get to ask any questions, but that would not be very fair. I'll ask you now, Othman, and again I'll keep up the trend of trying to chase after you with some of the points that Lawrence has put forward. Challenge the language aspect pertaining to religion in particular. He's given the examples of the language of Scripture, Islam being Arabic, the language of Scripture is Judaism being Hebrew, and so on. Could we consider this to be a limiting or prohibitive aspect? I mean, science may use SI units, but we can't really argue that science is limited to language. So is this one where science has a heads up on religion?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Again, because I don't put science and religion in the same boat and send them off on a honeymoon. It might get a bit tension. There might be some tension. No, the point is that they have different domains of operation. But yes, Dr. Krauss has made a number of points about the scriptures. Interpretation, for example. I think it's important that, just as in science, I mean, if I put out a line from his book and give my own interpretation, I think that's unfair. And I think similarly what he's done with the Bible, as much as I don't think he really hasn't quoted anything from the Quran, although he's still been able to allege that there's irrational and immoral stuff in there. But any scripture,
I tried to avoid that, but I've got a whole bunch here.
I think it should be by the interpretation of the people who believe in that. But on the issue of language, again, no, we don't say you can't understand it if you don't understand Arabic. You can understand it. It can be translated, and you can get the broad meaning that is being communicated. Nevertheless, this is a subjective point. Whether we talk about science or maths, quantum mechanics is highly technical. You need popularizers like Dr. Krauss, and he's done a good job at this, and Professor Dawkins, to make it simple for the public. But still, it doesn't mean everyone's going to understand it. So with the language, it's a subjective point. End of the day, it depends on the original question. Is it, especially if you're going to take the approach of, is something possible? Is it possible that God exists? That's the main question that we should come back to, I think. But if God does exist and He sends down a revelation in one language, is that possible? Yes, it's possible, whether you like it or not. So to suggest that because it's one language, it's not practicable. I mean, Islam is a religion now that's spread to all corners of the world. It's got millions of followers. They read the Quran. It's been learned off by heart from cover to cover by millions of people. So there's no argument of impracticality. It's there. The proof is in the pudding. So I think it's a subjective argument that rests on logically posterior objective arguments that were really our focus should be.
Well, T.S. Eliot said words are slippery, and they are. And so, of course, all words are subject to interpretation. People interpret my books all the time, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. But the key point is that it doesn't matter. That's the key point. It doesn't matter whether people understand my book. It doesn't understand whether they understand quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics works. It doesn't matter if people... What?
I was just about to say, words slippery because T.S. Eliot said they're slippery.
Good point.
Got you there.
Quantum mechanics works. Physics works. And it's independent of language, culture, race, sex, desires, as I often point out to people. And the key point, perhaps the key point that is worth discussing here, is that the universe doesn't give a damn what you like and don't like, what you want and don't want. Now, that's the basis. We all want, everyone wants a world that's based on fairness and justice, and it wouldn't be nice if someone took care of us. But I suggest that most of you here, because you're alive, if, for example, you were choking right now, I could do two things. I could perform a Heimlich maneuver, or I could pray for you. Most folks would argue that you die if I prayed for you. Okay? The difference is it doesn't matter what the language is, what the discussion is, what we want. It's what works. And that should be the basis of rational decision making. If we say, here's a rational decision, I can jump out that window if I'm on the 10th floor of a building here, I can fly. Well, I can think I'm going to fly, I can believe I'm going to fly, God can tell me I'm going to fly. If I jump out the window, I'm going to die. And so the basis of rationality should be making decisions based on, if you don't, your decision should be based on a consequence which is based on the evidence of reality. But I agree with you that, in fact, the fact that the interpretation of a book should not depend on the language that it's written in. But I'm often told that I can't understand the Quran because I don't speak Arabic. That's true, I don't speak Arabic. I speak a little Hebrew, but I don't speak Arabic. I don't speak Aramaic. I don't speak Latin. Well, I do. I did take Latin. But I don't speak ancient Greek. And so when I read the Quran, I read things that are offensive to me, just like I read things that are offensive to me in the Bible. When I see the actions of religious people, be it flying planes into buildings or putting women in bags, I find that offensive too. But I also see the same thing in the United States, equally offensive to me. When I see politicians from the Christian right who don't want to allow women to determine whether they can be valuable human beings, I find that offensive. I think that's probably the one universal to all religions. All organized religions, almost, all the three world major religions subjugate women. And so the one thing we could do to make the world a better place is get rid of religion so that women could have productive lives throughout the world. Anyway.
Any comments you would like to add?
No, that's okay.
All right, Professor Krauss, a question to you. I sort of had I think maybe I've linked a couple of arguments of yours into one, so apologies again if the length of the question is a little bit excessive. But I thought when you were talking about human beings that perhaps you've conflated the term hominoid and human being. I mean, as far as I understand, the general consensus would be that Homo sapiens sapiens are the definition of human being, and the things before that are hominoid. And I'm interested then because you sort of then...
Well, Homo sapiens go back more than 250,000 years.
Yeah, about 250,000 years.
Yeah. Okay.
And certainly then you added some points about the concept of human dignity. And I guess the general implication of that argument would be that religion, well certainly we said this in no uncertain terms, that religion is the antithesis to human dignity in some aspects. And obviously then the implication would be that pure rationality, i.e. science, based on empirical evidence, would improve human dignity or embrace human dignity. Now, just recently there was an article published in the British Medical Journal. It was actually produced by some philosophers, it wasn't by practicing doctors, that suggested that if we are to employ the current rationale for termination of fetuses, then we might as well apply it to newborn babies, and that we can just kill newborn babies as well because they have the same sense of self as a 12-week fetus and the same developed nervous system and so on. And we could go through other examples. I mean, if I wanted to be, really sort of convenient, picking out where science perhaps hasn't necessarily contributed to human dignity. Do you affirm that science is the promoter of human dignity and religion is not? And at the same time, I mean, what may be offensive to you as a clearly good-hearted scientist may not be offensive to, the Dr. Mengeles of the world.
Well, I think you made a huge... Everything you said was an interesting thing until you started the Dr. Mengeles. Because I think there are very few universal human mores that most people object to, but medicine creating painful experiments on living human beings are one that most civilized societies don't allow, like Mengele. But the question, I think, absolutely, science not only has contributed to human dignity, it's helped create it. Part of human dignity is to be able to live a life that's free of pain, suffering, hunger, as possible. And certainly, we wouldn't be there if it weren't for science. Human dignity involves allowing children the freedom to wonder, the freedom to experience everything that is good about being human. Art, music, literature, to read the world's literature, to read the wisdom of the world without censorship. Human dignity involves allowing people control of their lives. And certainly, by allowing abortion, we have increased the human dignity of women tremendously. Now, is it an interesting and difficult ethical question about abortion? Absolutely. There are certain questions, however, that are not difficult at all. And a blastocyst, a series of cells, is not a human being. Just not. And if you think it is because it has the potential to become a human being, then I will tell you that in the lifetime of most people in this room, I will fully expect that we will be able to create living human beings from not only non-living chemicals, but just from single eggs or single sperm cells. So, in that case, if potential to be a human being is the same as being a human being, then in the future, we're not going to have an ethical debate about abortion. We're going to have an ethical debate about masturbation.
Yeah, if I can, well, I mean, I think that the last point shows quite clearly that all those propositions are subjective. Every single one of them is subjective. Science cannot answer those questions. You can't put them under, a microscope and find out whether you're a human being at this point or at that point. You can't do it. It's all subjective. So, and this is why I mentioned again, this is a limitation of science, which if you ignore, then you will end up in these conundrums. Which is that if there's not a general agreement about the observation, and the whole point that science is based in observation is made redundant. Because now one person is looking at it and saying, well, I think it's this, and another person is going, oh, no, I think it's this, and I think it's this. You can't have empiricism on that basis. That's why it's outside the purview of science. And I know it's increasingly the case that scientists are arguing otherwise, at least the new atheist scientists are arguing otherwise. But I think there's no credible epistemological or theoretical argument first, not on particular issues, but on this point. Okay, that we use a scientific method. Now we're going to move into these areas, and this is how we justify so. In fact, what we find the opposite. Philosophers of science are trying to deal with these issues, but some scientists are saying, "Oh, no, that's not relevant." As the famous quote, I forget who said it. The philosophy of science is about as relevant to science as ornithology is to birds. Ornithology is the study of birds. And of course, the point is that birds don't know about it. But that's the retort, that the philosophical retort that came to that was to say that, well, if birds understood ornithology, it would be very beneficial to them. I.e., that if scientists understand the philosophy of science and these important issues about the assumptions, the implications, the boundaries, they do a lot better science, and all of us would be the beneficiaries of that.
Well, let me just say two things. First of all, no scientist I know suggests that science alone allows a complete analysis of ethical issues. The point, however, is that science informs. Without evidence of empirical reality, your decisions on ethical issues could be made and believed in, but they're irrational. Science informs ethical decisions. One of the reasons Rick Santorum in my country is such a nut is because he doesn't met an empirical fact he ever liked. And every statement he makes, from the fact that birth control encourages abortion to the statement that blastocysts are human beings, does not have a basis in empirical reality. That causes him to propose public policy decisions that are inappropriate. So what science does is inform our decision-making, and morality is impossible. A rational morality is impossible without understanding. You can't make a decision about how to act if you don't know what the consequences of your actions are. And science tells us what the consequences of your actions are. The last statement that science would be better if scientists knew more philosophy is clearly wrong. Most scientists can't spell philosophy. But somehow, in spite of the fact that scientists don't know philosophy, and I will agree with you that most scientists are not experts in philosophy, because instead of studying philosophy, they learned science. And instead of that, they produced a world where we learned how to control our existence in the way that science has done. A world where the lights in this room allow us to be able to speak and have a conversation after dark. Where we're able to come together as a group because we have locomotion created by science. Science is independent of philosophy because science is simply based on understanding how the world works. And that's plenty good enough. The why doesn't affect anything.
All right. We'll probably do one more of these questions directed at each speaker, but straight after that we'll be going to the written questions. Okay, and we'll go to the...
How long are we going?
So we finish at 8:30.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
that's when the formal structure finishes. So, but we'll make these ones very quick. So please, if you are going to prepare a written question, have it ready, and there'll be people walking around collecting them. Okay, last question directed to Flawed, and if both gentlemen could be reasonably quick on the two that are coming to them now. Flawed, Lawrence has repeatedly said that logic is entirely dependent upon reality, and that without reality we would not be able to come to logical conclusions. I know that you both have touched on that, but I'd like to hear some closing points on that, please.
Okay, I think it's an important issue because it touches upon the point about ascertaining the truth and whether science has a monopoly on that, or whether, even if there are other things, they are sort of they can only assist science in doing so. As I said, I agree, any ascertainment of truth has to be based in sense perception at some level, otherwise it has no legitimacy. But I argued that that's different from the scientific empiricism, does not equal the scientific method. Now, with logic, for example, I think there's an important point here. Professor Krauss said, quantum mechanics shows us some illogical things, electrons being in two places at one and so forth. I think the problem is that he ends up generalizing the findings of a very specific field. What do I mean? For example, Einstein's theories of relativity don't negate Newtonian principles in toto. They negate them at the astronomically large scale, at the astronomically small scale, at the extremely fast. Everywhere else, Newtonian principles apply. Similarly, quantum mechanics does not negate relativity, except in the subatomic level which it studies. So there's no... with respect to logic, I read Dr. Krauss write that logic has fallen by the wayside by the discoveries of science in the 20th century. And what does that mean? Logic has fallen by the wayside because of science, so now we can't have logical conversations, I can't make a logical point anymore. And that'd be a problem. All of us would be having conversations as if we were speaking to our wives. We can't really use much logic. But serious. That doesn't mean, all it means, what we find in quantum mechanics, with respect to all it means in respect to logic, is that at that level, what we found, and obviously much more research needs to be done, is that classical propositional logic does not apply at that level. That's it. It doesn't mean that I cannot use Aristotelian logic anymore. Right? Having said that, I agree, the premises need to be based on sense perception. You can't just say something obviously that wouldn't make sense. I can't start with the premise that all pink elephants live on Mars and then come with a minor premise and the conclusion. No, there has to be sense perception. And that's why I said when I spoke about reports and logic, he said about reports, if someone tells you this, do you believe it? I said, if they inform you in a way that collusion is inconceivable, and that's at the strongest level. But the point is, all of these have principles, qualifications, and limitations. If you're at home, if someone calls and says, such and such has happened, you know, or let's say, for example, your father has been in a car accident. Does that mean it's necessarily true? No, you make a mistake, could be playing a trick on you. Someone else calls you 2 minutes later, and then someone else, and then someone, and all these people are unrelated. Does that establish something for you? Maybe not necessarily, but at a stronger level. There comes a point where it is inconceivable that all these different people have been able to come together and collude on the same point. So again, it's context specific. But the point is, we can't generalize. Things apply in their areas with the limitations, and we need to understand them. And I was speaking about the philosophy of science that scientists should know, not about philosophy per se, which I think is an important qualification.
Well, I don't want to take too much longer. Well, let me point out that you shouldn't base things on your senses. Science never says that. Your senses are often wrong. You know, you can ask which hands that's in. You know, you can do a lot of magic tricks for you, where your senses will give you the wrong answer. Science, in fact, often doesn't use your senses. In fact, you have to be willing to second guess your senses. Science is best based on falsifiable predictions, based on evidence that can then be falsified. And so, if the evidence of your senses are often wrong. For example, I was having a discussion with my dear partner last night while looking at the moon coming up over the Telstra Tower, if you were looking at the part of where we were living in Canberra, and she didn't believe me that the moon is no bigger when it's coming over the Telstra Tower, because the moon looks bigger when it's the horizon, it is up there. And most people think it's a property of the atmosphere, but it's not. The moon is exactly the same size when you see it there. I said, not that the moon gets bigger, but even the image, if you take a camera picture of it and measure the size of that image, it's different. Your senses are certainly not reliable. And science, again, always says second guess. So it's not your senses. And in that sense, I never say that logic doesn't work. What I've said is that science, that logic has to be subjected to the evidence of reality, and that certain logical syllogisms, like the one you gave about Tom being a man and all men are mortal and Tom is a man and therefore Tom is mortal, changes when the science changes the reality. Henrietta Lacks's cell signs are immortal. Does that mean Henrietta Lacks's cells are not human? Absolutely not. But her cell line is immortal. So classical statements, and particularly Aristotelian statements, are subject to the evidence of reality. In fact, his Aristotelian logic that things fall heavier, fall faster, heavier things fall faster, was subject to the remarkable bit of evidence that that's not true. So I think the point is that logic is nice, but in the absence of trying to explore the real world, logic alone doesn't get you anywhere. Once again, I think of all philosophy, the most useless is the philosophy of science, because no one reads it except philosophers of science.
All right, we'll just move on to the last question that I have, because we've already got a couple of written questions, which is great. Professor Krauss, you've referred in A Universe from Nothing to the concept of eternal inflation. Now, this is my chance to actually ask something about a book that I didn't understand, so could you please elaborate on that?
Well, I don't know whether we want to spend a lot of time on it. It's possible that one of the things that's interesting is that our universe could have had a beginning, but that doesn't mean that it is everything that exists, in fact. That it could have arisen from a multiverse in which, in fact, space can arise from nothing by the laws of quantum mechanics very easily. But you can have what happened, all evidence in our universe was that at very early times, it started expanding very, very fast, and we call that inflation. It's actually doing it right now. One of the discoveries that motivated my book is the amazing discovery that most of the energy of the universe resides in nothing, which again sounds illogical, but it's true. You take space, you get rid of all of the particles, all of the gas, everything, that space weighs something. That's not supposed to be the case. We didn't like it. Most physicists said it would have been crazy 20 years ago, but that's the way it is. So the great thing about it is that even though we didn't like it, it's true. That's causing our universe to speed up faster and faster and faster. Well, you can argue that our early universe had such a period, but due to something called a phase transition, if I took this, well, better than this, a bottle of beer, and put it, because many of you, some of you, I shouldn't say many of you, clearly not many of you in this room, but some of you, if you drunk beer, will have had a party and you forgot to put the beer in the fridge before the party, so you put it in the freezer to try and get it cold, and then you take it out and you open it up and the whole thing cracks. Because what happens is, under high pressure, the beer remains a liquid, but the minute you let it go, the conditions change and the beer undergoes a phase transition into ice. Ice occupies more volume than water or alcohol in this case, and so the beer bottle breaks. The universe, we think, went through such a phase transition. But you can argue that in certain locations, when it went through such a phase transition, it stopped inflating. It stopped expanding exponentially. But all the rest of the regions of the universe didn't stop expanding. And if they're expanding exponentially, then no matter how fast you try and make a phase transition happen, you'll find that most of what you could have called the universe is still inflating. And our universe, which arose from that inflation stopping, is just a small region of an eternally expanding multiverse. So such a eternally expanding multiverse will be eternal in the future. Was it eternal in the past? Not necessarily. But who cares? It can be eternal in the future. So you can have an eternal future horizon without having an eternal past horizon, is the way to say it in physics. And it's quite likely it's happening in our universe now.
Do you have anything?
I'm sorry that wasn't clear, but I would suggest if you want a clearer argument, you buy the book.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think that's I think the key words there, which Dr. Krauss has used a number of times now, is it can be like this, it may be like this, it's possible for it to be like this, which is not a problem in and of itself, but it is a problem when you then use that to try and qualify or to contend against theories or facts or arguments that are far more plausible. I think this sort of trend is evident throughout. For example, I think there's a clear example here. Dr. Krauss wrote this article just at the beginning of this month in the LA Times, and he says in it that quantum mechanics Heisenberg's uncertainty principle expands what can possibly occur undetected in otherwise empty space. If gravity too is governed by quantum mechanics, then even whole new universes can spontaneously appear and disappear, which means our own universe may not be unique, but instead part of a multiverse. Now that's a logical argument. There's a few premises there, there's a conclusion. But notice how there's a possibility, built upon a possibility, to end up with, obviously, a far lesser possibility. Now, in the end, the argument is highly uncompelling, but possible. But it's being used to say, to qualify, to say, yeah, look, there is this model that is far more plausible, the Big Bang model, but, this could be the case, we're still working on. And so we'll stick on to that. We'll come up with new and exotic scenarios of how the world could have been like this or it could have been like that. Now, scientifically, we should look at all possibilities, but the problem occurs when you then grab onto very, very remote possibilities and speculative, highly speculative scenarios in order to contend against arguments or theories that are far, far more plausible.
Let me step back, because you really hit a key point.
Yep.
The key thing of science is we don't claim to know everything. In fact, the point of religion is you claim to know the truth before you know anything. And in science, I make a big distinction between what we know, mainly measurable facts, and what might be true, because I believe in being honest. And in fact, as a scientist, one of the most wonderful things about being a scientist, as I've often say, the best state to be in is be either wrong or confused, because it means there's more to learn. So I am happily aware that I don't understand everything. It's evident to me on a daily basis. And therefore, I make a very important point when I write to make a difference between what's been subject to experiment and what is plausible. Now, the fact that something's plausible, I try and explain why it's plausible. the particles in empty space that I talk about from the Eisenhower uncertainty principle are not plausible, they're facts. They produce the best measured predictions in nature that allow us to do spectroscopy, measure, look for cancer, everything else. So those are not speculative. However, we don't have a theory of quantum gravity, and I was upfront about that. I hope one of the things I work on is to try and understand the theory of quantum gravity. But I think it is a hallmark of the one beauty of science that we don't claim to know everything, but it is fascinating that we can ask what's plausible. Now, you say that this leads to an incredibly implausible possibility that space may have been created from nothing. Now, why that is implausible to you, I find amazing. Moreover, why it's more implausible to you than the claim that the universe is so complex that it required a being that was even more complex. But I won't ask where that being created, how that complex being was created, because I can't answer that question, so I'm going to make him eternal. Then I'm going to say that that complex being, which is more complex than the universe that I can't understand, created a universe, waited 4.5 billion years, waited 250,000 years for hominids to become reasonable, found an illiterate peasant before video recorders or anything else, and revealed the truth to him. Why you find that more plausible is remarkable to me.
Please give both speakers a round of applause. Okay, basically I've divided the questions that I've got into those that are directed to either speaker, those that are directed to both, and those that are miscellaneous. I'm not cutting out any questions, I'm just going to work through them as quickly as we can. I know also that some people expressed interest in purchasing the book but may have had to leave early. We will have an individual at the back who will be able to sort out that transaction for you if you need to leave early. Okay, directed to both speakers, and gentlemen, if you could please keep your responses as concise as possible. We've got about 50 questions here. In terms of whether religion or science is liberating, is there anything in your religion or science, is there anything that your religion or science will not permit as a possibility? For example, Bostrom proposes that it is possible that it is more likely we're living in a simulation. This simulation will contain various religious figures. In principle, this hypothesis is falsifiable. Is it absolutely excluded in your worldview? We'll start with Osman.
Yes, that is, and I think in most worldviews, even though some people may say theoretically no, but practically yes. And this is why I know Dr. Krauss has said some things about philosophy today. I'm not a philosopher as such, and I think there are problems with philosophy. This is one of them, where if you divorce the theory from the practice, anything can be a possibility. So the point is, if it is a simulation, when you cross a road, when you cross a busy road, and even if you assume it's not a simulation, if you're not willing to assume it's a simulation and walk without looking two ways, then you can put that falsifiable or not, that hypothesis aside. And so generally most philosophers, most theologians, most scientists agree that the world is not a simulation. And that's the type of thing that you simply cannot demonstrate, not scientifically and nor otherwise.
Well, my answer is no. It's not impossible. I could imagine. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that we are a simulation. I'm sure it's occurred to everyone. There's lots of science fiction about it. It's highly likely to me that we will create machine consciousness in the next century or two. I see no impediments to that. We have virtual worlds we can create now. Could we make a world that's complex enough so that the virtual creatures in that world felt that they had a consciousness? Absolutely. Could we create laws of physics which may even be different than the laws we have in our universe for those beings? We could. I don't know whether they'd be consistent. But so if we're in a very good simulation that's consistent, then there's no way to distinguish it from a reality. And the question, in that sense, is irrelevant. The question is, it's as real to us as reality. The question is, how does it work? And that's all that really scientists want to know, is how does it work? So we can understand things, enjoy things, and make a better future.
This question is directed to Dr. Krauss, and for those that are writing the questions, it's a combination of two because they were both very similar. You mentioned that as a result of religion, people are destroying buildings with planes and women are subjugated. What do you have to say about brutal foreign policy resulting in killing of thousands of people, and women are looked at as an object in society? And also, the scientifically developed world has the highest rate of suicide and other psychological illnesses. Can science address these issues?
What do I say about brutal foreign policy? I think it's brutal and horrible. I don't see what that has to do with religion. Often it's the basis of religion. It's been based on religious. Far more violence has been done in the name of religion than anything else. But, that argument is made, and I think it's... So brutal foreign policy is bad. I don't know what else to say. In terms of, what was the second part of the question?
Subjugating women, also science's solutions for suicide and psychological illness.
Well, eventually, I hate to say it, but I do think that eventually science will understand the neural basis of many of our emotions, and whether it'll produce a brave new world or not, I'm not certain. But one of the things that science does do is take people with psychotic delusions and have developed drugs that help them. So we certainly don't understand consciousness. That's why I do physics, because it's so easy. Really, it's much more easy than understanding consciousness, which is a much more fascinating question, and I think about it all the time, but it's a complex issue. And so, but science has tried to help us understand the neurological basis of certain problems, from depression, some of which is chemically based, and we can treat people with drugs to improve that, to other neurological problems. So science can certainly help with that. Does science alone produce a world? Does science cause problems? Absolutely. The fact that I now can't go anywhere without being bombarded, the need to look for my email, is an awful thing. But, but what we have to do is, if we're going to be able to deal with the societal problems of technology, we should understand it, try and educate people as broadly as possible so that public policy can keep up with a rapidly changing world based on technology.
All right, question to Othman, and again, this is a combination of a few questions that are quite similar. If we assume that your presumption that infinity cannot exist in nature, how do you explain the creation of God? Explain simply who created God, and to add to this, it's sort of a supplementary. Some research has shown that human beings have a high propensity to feel the need for a greater purpose. Do you believe that this may have affected your beliefs?
So I might be subject to the high propensity that everyone's subject to, perhaps. I don't know. Who created God? What was the first part of that question?
Sorry, if infinity doesn't
exist
in nature,
if infinity doesn't exist, who created God? I don't see how those two propositions are related in any form or way whatsoever, but nevertheless, I think the real question there is this one about who created God. The first point I'd make is that, and I think Dr. Krauss did this as well, responding to points made in the existence for God, or the arguments for the existence of God, that I just didn't make. I didn't say those things that he mentioned in the end about, because there's a beginning, there has to be a God, and then this God does this. Now, I gave a very specific argument, and if people can address that, that'd be easier. The point is that if we can't sense something empirically, we can't apply thought to it. So you can't ask the question, who created God, without addressing the question of, does God exist? Right? When you address this question, your starting point is what you can sense, what you can empirically observe. Now, that's what I did. When you do that, and you arrive at the understanding that God exists, you don't just arrive at the understanding that it's a God. There are attributes that come necessarily with it. And I showed you those. So if you can't have the infinite regress, if you can't be infinite and it can't be from nothing, and that is what requires the existence of God, then necessarily there can't be anything before that. Otherwise, you're back in the infinite regress. So this is the point. You need to work one step to the other step in a logical fashion. You can't start by asking the question, who created God? That presumes God exists. If we're going to presume it, then we might as well not have come and had this discussion. So you can't presume it. The evidence shows, the argument shows that this God exists and these are his attributes. To then ask a question that is, who created him, is a meaningless statement, because as soon as we prove God exists, by definition that God is uncreated. So it'd be like asking, after proving something about a circle, or what about, can this circle be a round circle or a married bachelor? Those words are meaningless. Not by presumption, but by the very way in which we establish that God exists in a logical and structured fashion.
Thank you. Directed to both speakers, although I think the answer to this will be obvious, and it's probably 15 seconds, no more than that. What happens when you die? Start with Professor Krauss.
The same thing as what happened before you were born.
What happens when you die? Again, if we put this question within the context of our discussion, science can't answer that question. Clearly, you can't sense anything. Once you're dead, you're dead. No one's been able to go into the world of the dead. We may be able to. I don't know. Maybe.
Well, in some religions, people haven't come back.
Right.
Okay.
So, the only way to know that is through having discussed and proved the existence of God. You're going to have to assume that for this question is by being informed through some revelation. Now, I emphasized the point in my presentation that you cannot jump from God exists to the Quran is from God, or the Bible is from God, or any other scripture is. That has to also be substantiated rationally. And if we had time for that, I certainly would do that. There is some pamphlet at the back that put forth the argument. But once that is done, again, this is a prior point. Once that is done, then we are told that once you die, what happens is X, Y, Z. There is a resurrection. There's a day of judgment. There's heaven and hell. There's recompense, and the rest of it. None of which is empirically provable. But this is the point, that it rests on premises that are rationally provable. And this is how you move in a logical way from the natural to the supernatural, without having this bias against the supernatural in the first instance, where everything has to be natural unless you're forced to resort to the supernatural.
Thank you.
Okay, I would love to have your
Dr.
question.
Krauss, again, I think that the answer to this question will be quite short. I may be wrong. You said no energy, effort, power, etc. is required to create a universe. Care to demonstrate by creating a universe for us. Now, I must emphasise that I'm reading the questions as given. So.
We trust you.
Well, there are lots of things I can't do for you in this room. I could create a nuclear weapons explosion that would turn mass into energy, but I can't do it right now, and I think you're probably happy I can't. I'm certainly happy that most people who believe strongly in religion can't do it yet either, and certain religions. What I could demonstrate for you is that the laws of physics, this is what I can demonstrate for you if you're willing to follow the arguments, and that requires some willingness, is that the same laws of physics that allow you to drive here in your car lead irrevocably to certain conclusions. And that's why I would argue that certain fundamentalists who believe the earth is 6,000 years old, for example, and there are Islamic fundamentalists who believe that, there are Jewish fundamentalists, there are Christian fundamentalists, so this is not aimed at anyone in particular, but they're hypocrites. Because if they believe that, they should not get in a car or an airplane or turn on the lights, because the laws of physics that produce one irrevocably produce conclusions and predictions that can falsify the latter. So, and similarly, I can't help it, but yeah, anyway. There are things that I can't do in this room, but I can tell you, based on the things I can do, one can make predictions that you can test that will allow those things to happen. And unlike, say, making the revelation that God revealed himself in the Quran, and the attributes of God are determined by that, as opposed to the attributes of Thor, Zeus, Hera, Jupiter, all of whom were strongly believed in by the people who somehow believed that God had those attributes.
Thank you. One more written question to each speaker, and then we'll take live ones if there are any, and then the speakers also have their closing remarks. So that answers one of the questions that came through. Man, do you think that the way your religion treats women enables them to be liberated?
Absolutely, I do. And I think the easiest way to find that out is to ask, instead of, I think there's a trend in Orientalist studies, in Western studies of the Orient, to put yourself in the shoes of people who you think can't think for themselves, and to tell them how they need to think and how they're being oppressed. The simplest way is to ask Muslim women around you. There are Muslim women in the room. Ask them. They're not forced here in Australia. No one's putting a gun to their neck. Ask them whether they're liberated or they're oppressed. So again, the point is, I mean, to the extent that something is not empirically testable or falsifiable, it's subjective. It can't be objective, right? So a law, when we talk about social laws, legislation, economic policy, I mean, science can't do these things. They're going to be subjective. We can have a discussion about them, but to suggest that because it's one way, this is oppressive in one way, it's not. This is entirely subjective and is not built on any solid basis. You can argue either way, and that's why it needs to be grounded in something. I'm suggesting that our laws are not grounded in people sitting around in Parliament and thinking and having childish fights and coming up with some legislation. I think that's bad. I think that's limited. You're restricted to human experiences. So our legislation is based on the revelation, which, as I said, needs to be substantiated. But once it is, then that's a solid, rational argument. Otherwise, to just pick out laws and to look at them either out of context or out of the coherent system, or is subjective judgments and nothing more.
Thank you. And finally, to Professor Krauss, and I dare say that I can predict the answer to this as well. It might have something to do with reading your book. You said that the beginning of the world was the Big Bang. As a fact, it cannot be negotiated. Can you please tell me what was the cause for the Big Bang?
Well, of course, one thing doesn't fall from the other. The Big Bang is a fact, as much as a fact as the Earth is round. I wish I knew the cause of the Big Bang. Namely, I wish I knew the laws of physics break down as we now understand them at T equals 0, because we don't have a quantum theory of gravity that I can. We have many facets that we understand the quantum theory of gravity must possess that suggest what is likely, but I don't know. And I'm proud of the fact that I don't know, because it gives me something to work on.
Thank you very much. Are there any live questions? Okay.
Any dead questions?
Now, for people that actually had a question, and we'll rely on honesty here, I know that you have one. For people that had a written question answered, or something close, put your hands down. Okay, all right, we'll start with you, please.
This one goes with mine. I have a very close Muslim friend. She's a woman. She's a first-year university student. One of the things she told me was that she had planned her life ahead. She knows that by the time she finishes her degree, she'll probably be married, and then she'll have children. She has her life planned ahead of her completely. How is this in any way not restricted? This is not, in her belief, she's not allowed to. I ask her if there were any other options. She disregards if. There are no other options. There's only one point of view. If women are subject to one kind of belief, why do people have the right to decide whether or not a child that is not even fully formed into a human form, why do people have the right to say, no, you can or you can't kill that unborn child, but have the right to say, this child, when it is born, it will be a religious child. It's going to be brought up as either a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew.
Can you just clarify, when you say planned, did she plan it herself, or is it other people who are planning this for her?
She tells me that many girls, many Muslim women, already accept this plan. They say, we know what's going to happen. We know how life will become.
Yeah, so it's her own decision. I just want to find out whether it's her own decision.
Yeah, it's her own
based on whatever,
Yep,
it's her own decision. Otherwise, obviously, it's a different scenario. Well, I mean, the point is, it comes back to the same issue. All these points that we're discussing here, to the extent that they're discussions of social phenomena, how do you live your life, what's the best way, when to get married, to have children early or late. Science doesn't help us. There's the social things. Either you leave it to your own mind, you look at what's around you, you depend on your community, on the religion or whatever it may be that you've grown up in, and you make a decision. The point is to say that it's restrictive or not liberating is to come from a different worldview. To come, for example, from a liberal worldview and say, well, because we do things like this, that must be a problem. Now, how do we find it liberating? We find it liberating because we understand, yes, and there is restrictions, there are a lot of restrictions. The reason that's liberating, again, because I define liberation not as being able to follow your whims, but being able to ascertain the reality and act on its basis. So the reason these laws and restrictions are liberating is because they tell us about the truth, and we are then aided in acting on the reality. Otherwise, we're left to our own limited, biased minds to come up with a solution. And of course, the point again here is when I claim it's the truth, I need to show that. That's why I bring that point back to this point. That in the end, it's the objective foundations that are key. Once you settle them, all the subjective answers have to be grounded in those. But that's generally how we see restriction as liberation. I mean, it's like a child. A child wants to do whatever they want, but the parent says, "Oh, you should do this, don't do that, do this, be careful." You're restricting the child, right? Is that restrictive in a bad sense? It's not. You know better. Similarly, when the human becomes an adult, they're still, in relative terms, a child to how much they don't know about the world. So if there's a God, if there's a revelation, priors, which have to be objectively substantiated, then you can understand how laws are liberating and not restrictive.
Can I comment?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so offended by some of the statements there. But what you really hit it at the end.
Yep.
Religion treats adults as children. And says that adults, it's absolutely true, we tell children what to do because they're children. But if we're good parents, we realize as the children grow up and become adults, they have to make their own decisions. And we try and train them to make good decisions, because that's what good parents try to do. And we don't say, call me up, and I'll tell you what to do when you're 25 years old. And if we did, it wouldn't matter. And so the notion that human beings, when they become adults, are not capable of making decisions, but must have a morality determined by the whim of the religion that your parents have to be in. Whether, what's her name? I think I have it written here. Azami, whether she was liberated by being shot dead in 2005 in Gaza for the crime of being unchaperoned in a car with her fiancé, or whether the many girls who are liberated in India by being stoned for having committed the crime of being raped and dishonoring their family, whether that's liberating is just ridiculous to suggest that somehow morals are based on revelations which depend upon the sect that you happen to have, each of which has different morals. The fact that humans cannot determine for themselves as adults how to behave is the big problem with religion, because it keeps everyone as a children and suggests that someone else knows what's better for you on the basis of some book that was written by someone who claimed he knew the answers and has no proof that he did.
Thank you for that. And we'll take one question for Professor Krauss. I'm sure that there'll be discussion afterwards, by the way, so don't feel as though this is here.
How can you be liberated or inspired by atheism when atheism teaches that there is no afterlife, you cease to exist when you die you become nothing more than garden compost, and that we are simply a highly evolved form of pond scum? Isn't that a pretty depressing and uninspiring worldview, what I would call a theology of despair? By way of contrast, is not the belief that we are intelligently designed by God, are spiritual beings with a purpose, and have an eternal destiny far more liberating? And maybe Uthman might, after you finish, Uthman might care to comment on it as well.
Well, as I tried to indicate at the beginning, I do have a philosophical bias, and I find that not liberating, but I'll explain why. I find my connections to the cosmos, as I've written, the fact that my atoms come from stars that have exploded, that will one day, that the atoms that Julius Caesar breathed out in his dying breath when he said, "Et tu, Brutus, I breathe in every moment of every day." That I'm connected to the people I'm supposed to hate. That I'm connected to all of humanity by those atoms on a daily basis. I find that spiritually inspiring. I find the fact that in this vast universe of 400 billion galaxies, each of which contain hundreds of billions of stars, that here in a remote corner in the middle of nowhere, we happen to evolve the consciousness that allow us to ask the questions that you just asked, inspiring. I find the fact that I have a consciousness and a rationality that can cause me to ask questions about the universe and answer them inspiring. In fact, the fact that I can make meaning in my own life, that I can enjoy music and literature, inspiring. I don't find inspiring the fact that someone else has created for me exactly what my past and future will be inspiring. I find that so disgustingly prohibitive that I can't imagine it. I can't imagine, in fact, how an eternity with my family would be anything I would ever want to have.
Any comments?
Yeah, just quickly, I think I agree that if we have to distinguish here between looking at the products of the worldviews and asking, are they liberating? And if we were to do that, so away from the substantiation, but the end products, I think it's very simple to suggest, or very clear that the atheist worldview is hardly liberating. We're a dying race in a dying universe. And obviously you can go from that and make leaps of faith and still claim that we need to be good and we need to do X, Y, and Z, but that's something else. Nevertheless, I agree with Dr. Krauss that we should accept the universe as it is. So we can talk about, we can say, if it's like this, these are the implications, and I agree entirely that if that's the view, it is entirely not liberating, and you do need what some have called false lies. You need false lies in the atheist narrative to be able to live a fulfilling and liberating life. But again, the real discussion is can you show that the universe is like that? Because if it is like that, even if you don't like it, you should accept it. I think that's an important distinction.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the question. Sorry not everyone got to ask a question, but we are trying to keep to time. As I said, there will be discussion afterwards, and just a reminder that everyone is invited to hang around for tea, coffee, biscuits, etc. in the foyer at the conclusion. I'll invite Othman now to sum up in a little under 5 minutes or so, and then Professor Krauss will be given the same opportunity.
You're going to time me this time? Yeah. Set you up for this. Okay. 5 minutes and 5 minutes? And 10 seconds? Okay.
You have 10 of my seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So kind of you. I think it's been a good discussion, and I think there's a lot of benefit to these discussions where we can sit together and discuss what are differing worldviews. I'll leave you with some final remarks. I think that certainly as part of the animal genus, there is, as I've said, the urge to live life chasing after our base desires, one whim after another. And I've argued, I don't think that's liberation. Rather, liberation is the ability and the resolve to ascertain the truth and to act according to the dictates of that knowledge. The most fundamental reality, as indicated by the sound intellect, I will argue, is God, the transcendent being who exists necessarily, who has all the attributes of perfection, and upon whom everyone and everything else depends for their existence. He sees and hears all, he knows all, and has power over all things. The one for whom the sound heart yearns, and to whom it inclines, and indeed in the remembrance of whom it finds rest. Certainly in the remembrance of God, do hearts find rest. Science is a great thing, and I hope from anything, you won't take away from anything that I was arguing against science. Science is a great thing. It allows rigorous study of the material world. It allows us to exploit the material world for the benefit of humanity. But there is so much more to the world than the material. The material satisfies the body, but it does nothing for the soul. And that's why the age of materialism is an age of overnourished souls with overnourished bodies with malnourished souls, and the results have been devastating in terms of poverty, wealth inequalities, corruption and injustice and crime. There is a dire need for change. There's a dire need to go beyond the material and to give attention to the spiritual. And as I've argued tonight, I think the atheist narrative, the other view, the atheist narrative, is unsatisfactory in this respect. First, it fails to explain anything. It fails to explain, it has no answers to the fundamental questions of life, and in turn, it seeks merely to celebrate the fact that this ignorance is somehow good. Secondly, it seeks to pass ideology, unable to substantiate this ideology on its own merits as science. And thirdly, betrays the double standard, as I hope I've showed, of appealing to the most speculative of positions whilst demanding conclusiveness from opposing views. Finally, it seeks to pass scientific evidence as the only tolerable evidence so that it can then go on and say that there is no existence for God. In this context, I think religion and theology have much to offer. It furnishes the conceptual framework in which science can flourish. And I'll point to the historical record there. But theoretically also, it provides direction needed by the underlying theory that is necessary to interpret observation. It solves the metaphysical problems that science encounters but is ill-equipped to handle. If science is accepted, for example, the fact that the universe is past finite, that it has an absolute beginning, they would save themselves much time and energy that is currently being wasted in this wild goose chase to come up with these weird scenarios to dodge this conclusion. These resources could be spent elsewhere in a lot of needed scientific research of direct benefit to humanity. As for God, the evidence is there. That is not what the problem is. Rather, the problem, I will argue, is in the frivolous attitude towards that evidence, which points to, I think, the deeper problem. Rust, if I can say that, as it were, on the hearts, or as we would call them in our tradition, diseases of the heart, with which we are all afflicted. Arrogance, pride, jealousy, laziness, apathy, giving in to base desires, self-aggrandizement, negligence, frivolity, and the like. The call to God, finally, is a call to humility, to sincerity, to gratitude, to action, to serve the creation in adoration of the Creator. It is a call to the spiritual beyond the material, but importantly, it is a call grounded in reason, understandable, appreciable, and ascertainable by human reason. And this is the call that will liberate you and us. And this is the call I ask you to give due consideration to with a sincere heart and an open mind. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll be shorter.
Please.
Okay. You always stand behind me. Okay. It's all right. Well, this wasn't a debate on the existence of God. I wouldn't have had such a debate. I don't think it's worth debating. But on whether belief in God is prohibitive or liberating. Now, in fact, my good friend Steven Pinker has written a recent book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And in fact, the people who claim that the materialist world is worse than it was are, of course, wrong by all the data. The data suggests that the world, in fact, violence has decreased over human history. Living in the Middle Ages, regardless of whether you were in the